Good day, everyone, and welcome to Northern Arizona University's 45th Economic Outlook Conference. This panel will discuss the United States Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, otherwise known as USMCA. I'm Charles Cervantes. I'm the managing member of Business and Procurement Partners, LLC, a limited liability company which consults on federal grants and contracts, as well as all aspects of international business transactions. I first became interested in North American free trade as an Organization of American States Fellow, and later as Counselor for Legal Affairs to an Ambassador at Large at the State Department. Most recently, I testified before the United States International Trade Commission advocating for ratification of this treaty, the USMCA. We have a superb panel to discuss this new treaty. Our first panelist will be Al Zapanta. Al Zapanta has spent over a quarter of a century dealing with North American trade, energy, and investment in all three countries. As the president of the United States-Mexico Chamber of Commerce, he initiated a number of programs along our southwestern border, treating common issues with the 4 states on the north side of the border and the 6 states on the southern side of the southwestern border. Luis Ramirez Thomas, too, has spent decades working in areas of development, manufacturing, site selection, ports of entry, and construction. And Luis can shed light on what border infrastructure may help us as we enter this new chapter of a trilateral trade agreement. Melissa Sanderson has had a distinguished career at the State Department with experience in international trade, development, and foreign investments. But most recently and most pertinent to the panel today is her experience with business communities along the Arizona-Mexico border. So she can shed some light into that area. Before presenting questions to each panelist, each panelist will have 5 minutes to respond. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the USMCA. The USMCA is a very lengthy and complex document. There are 63 components, 34 chapters, 13 annexes, and 16 side letters. It's very lengthy. But I've selected 3 for purposes of an overview, which I think are chapters pertinent to the small business community and investors in infrastructure along the border. Number 1 is robust participation of small and medium-sized enterprises in the USMCA. We call them small businesses here, like the Small Business Administration. But this is so important to the treaty that it was placed in the preamble. So the chapter says we want to create this international network of dedicated small business centers and export assistance centers, incubators, and accelerators to create this network. And why does the treaty want to create this network? Is to share best practices and market research. The next chapter that I've highlighted, and I see Al's come. Hi, Al, how you doing? The next chapter is with digital trade, chapter 19. Chapter 19 recognizes that digital trade is very important to going to the next level, and it wants to create consumer confidence in structures that will enhance and accelerate digital trade. The third chapter is chapter 14, and chapter 14 is for cross-border investment. What chapter 14 does is it accords a foreign investor the same equal protection of the law as a domestic investor in the host country. This is very important, and I know that all of our panelists are familiar with the equal protection of the laws when somebody makes a substantial foreign investment. So with that overview, and this is not to limit the scope of this to any one area, because we have three experts here who are quite familiar with all aspects of this lengthy new trade agreement. What I'd like to do is ask Al Zapanta the first question. Al, this will be kind of a combination question. After 25 years of NAFTA, Al, how do you see or foresee Mexico approaching and implementing this new treaty? And along with that, how do you see nonprofit institutions like chambers of commerce, like foundations, like universities like NAU, and institutes like this Economic Development Institute, helping create that infrastructure with centers or otherwise? Al, you're up.
Thank you, Charles. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel, along with our good friend, Dr. Joseph Guzman there at the university. Melissa, Luis, it's good to see you. Thank you for letting me be part of this panel, because if I ask Luis, he'll probably tell me, no, not yet. That goes back a long way, Charles, as you know. So anyway,
we go back a long way.
Anyway, Melissa's the only young one in this group, so Melissa, you got it made. Anyway, bottom line, as you all know, I go all the way back to the beginnings of NAFTA as the senior advisor to Ronald Reagan in 1980, when we started the beginnings of the North American Accord. And during the 80s, of course, Luis was the key player in the Border Trade Alliance. And so, as well as you, Charles, and when we affected our environmental window, as well as our 7 principles of environmental stewardship with SEMERNAP and our friends at EPA and the BEC. So fast forward, the USMCA, in my estimation, was a very, very positive update. And it's all for the areas that you talked about. We did not have a small business component. We did not have digital trade and investment, and how we could make sure that they were safe and secure. And of course, the cross-border trade we've always had, but one of the areas that always has been a challenge is the enforcement. Let me add 2 other areas. Labor. We're going through a real process right now on the USMCA, and where you have a situation where Mexico has passed a law on dealing with labor, which is not really consistent with what was agreed during the USMCA between all 3 nations, especially US and Canada. But most specifically, we're going to start to see, I think, some real challenges, I guess I want to call them, in that area, because the Mexican Senate has now stepped in to try to figure out how to maybe make it more rational. And I'm talking mainly about the subcontracting from the major corporations. The other is the environmental piece, which also includes energy, it includes Pemex, it includes CFE. And so that application is really questionable, and especially when some of the contracts were abrogated and now being discussed, both with the new airport in Mexico, along with some of the pipeline midstream contracts that CFE was in charge of. I guess my bottom line of all of this, and why we at the U.S.-Mexico Chamber, I've asked Luis and Charles, hopefully Melissa will join us as our North American working group that we put together, that we did at the beginning when USMCA was being promulgated, and we had our input at the U.S. Trade Representatives Conference for input from the private sector and NGOs. But most specifically, our feeling is at this point, in fact, our meeting of our board is next week, the 17th, and where we're announcing our go forward strategy on the implementation of the USMCA as it relates to what we call, it's our North American Working Group. And so all 10 of our chapters have put together the kind of task forces. Luis, you and I talked a little bit about that, and where we're trying to focus on the border, number one, as to the whole area of the cross-border trade and investment. Maquiladora has a key, obviously, historical perspective. And then as we look at some of the other areas that we're concerned about, and one of them is essential industries. As you know, Mexico did not align with what Canada and the United States went forward with as far as essential industries. And two of our major members, corporations, were caught in that because Mexico did not consider them essential industries, where US and Canada did. I can go on at this point. My feeling is that's my sense of it. I do think it's a good agreement, but a long way from it finally being implemented with all the norms, regs, and regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Our next question is for Melissa Sanderson. Melissa, how can Arizona's economic components influence development, investment, and trade growth as a result of USMCA?
Thanks, Charles, and thanks, Al and Luis also. Yeah, I think that Al just mentioned a very critical word, and that word is strategy. And I think that what is going to be very important in bringing the greatest amount of benefits to Arizona from the USMCA is a coordinated statewide strategy. And organizations like ours, the U.S.-Mexico Chamber, working together with some of the other really strong economic development organizations that we have in the state of Arizona, can play a really key role in positioning us for success collectively. We have the Arizona Commerce Authority, we have the Arizona Chamber of Commerce, we have the Greater Phoenix Economic Council, we have a whole selection of very dynamic, very active, very successful economic development agencies. But that element of strategic vision, that element of coordination is what's going to make a difference. Arizona is epitomized, for instance, by its fast-growing tech industry, and within that is a subcategory of that, we have healthcare technology. Both of those have a virtually unlimited potential for increased future growth. And I think that particularly under the digital provisions of the USMCA, there is tremendous ground to be exploited and tremendous opportunities to be realized. Just to give one example, we should be trying to lure some more Canadian companies down here to base in Arizona, where they can more easily cooperate with Mexican partners, whether they wish to eventually establish themselves on the southern side of our border or not. And I think that there's another area which is particularly relevant to the conversation today, which is continuing to build on an already outstanding level of academic cooperation, because all three of our major universities have important partnerships already in place in Mexico. And we need to move beyond simply considering those from the educational perspective. We need to take a look at those in terms of their potential industrial applications. We can be doing so much more with 3D printing, with coordinating, for instance, on the monitoring of the labor provisions in Mexico through academic sources, which have their own rigorous standards and a certain degree of credibility that perhaps government authorities sometimes don't. So, and that also requires strategic coordination. And I think that rather than necessarily waiting for that coordination to strike like lightning from on high, and I say this as a woman who worked in the Foreign Service for 20 some years, I think it's incumbent upon us to come together at our so-called grassroots levels and initiate that strategic vision, which we will then be well positioned to take to the leadership on all three sides of the border and say, here's a model for success that incorporates our small businesses as represented, for example, by the Arizona District Export Council, which I chair, and for our larger businesses represented in organizations like the Arizona Technology Council. And I think that if we can get everybody in the room, and Al, why don't you be the convener? Or maybe we'll get Joseph Guzman to be the convener. If we can just get everybody in the room with a sharp focus to share some of these ideas and bring together strategic vision, focused initially perhaps on three key economic development areas, I think that we can put Texas in the dust for a change.
I love it.
And I'm going to stop there.
Okay, well, thank you, Melissa. That was not only informative, but very entertaining. I must disclose to you that I'm a graduate of the University of Texas, so hook 'em horns. I have to do that for my alma mater, but I respect it. What? Okay, so the next question will be for Luis. And USMCA will provide, as I mentioned earlier, equal protection of the law for foreign investors in a host country. As a lawyer, I kind of understand that. And as an advisor to companies that have invested in other countries, you always want to get your money back and your profits. So if you could shed some light on maybe what experiences with the Border Trade Alliance, you could kind of update us on foreign investment in critical industries.
Well, good morning to all, or good afternoon in the East Coast, or wherever people might be. It's a great opportunity to share the panel with Charles, with Mel, and Al. And I know Al for many years when both he and I had black hair. So time does not stop for anyone, but it's a pleasure to be here. But Charles, let me tell you a little bit of what we're seeing here on the border. In terms of companies, I think the USMCA has revamped the opportunity and the competitiveness of North America. We're seeing three types of companies that are looking at our border region, not just Arizona, Sonora, but the U.S.-Mexico border. Yes, there are the U.S. companies that are looking to leverage what Mexico and in some cases Canada has to offer because now they have this, revamped trade agreement. I think the second one we see and ties in with the pandemic and the stopping of supply chains that Al addressed earlier. We're seeing U.S. companies that were manufacturing almost exclusively in China, reshoring that to North America. But the third one that I think it's even more interesting is the fact that we see Chinese companies that were selling their products into North America that are now looking at the USMCA and going, hey, if I want to remain competitive with my products in the North American market, I better be making it or making most of it there. So we are looking at, like I said, two types of U.S. companies and Chinese companies that are investing in our border, and particularly in the Arizona-Sonora region, which both Mel and I are very familiar with. We're looking at Chinese companies. They're not coming in and looking for 50, 100 jobs. They're looking, buying 15, 20 acres of land on both sides of the border. There's not just manufacturing in Mexico, but there is supplemental manufacturing that's going to happen in addition to distribution and logistics on the U.S. side of the border. Our border communities in Arizona are very small, but it's a very much a highly productive, workforce. So we're very excited about that. And to put things into context, the Arizona border, which is only just about 300 miles long with Mexico, last year we processed about 46 million people in two-way traffic. We also looked at about 840,000 trucks. Those 840,000 trucks crossed about $30 to $35 billion worth of goods. And again, we are, aside from New Mexico, we're the third largest portion of the border, California and Texas. So when we look at our border, it's a tremendous opportunity. It's a gateway to North America. It's leveraging what both sides of the border have to offer. And I think companies are seeing that. I'll give you more direct examples in the automotive sector. We have a number of particularly, driverless and electric vehicles being manufactured here. One in specific that I want to mention is Lucid Motors. Lucid Motors conducted a search throughout North America as to where to establish their manufacturing and auto assembly facility. And they picked Casa Grande, just south or between Tucson and Phoenix, for those that are not as familiar with Arizona. Not only did they pick it because of what Arizona has to offer, but it is essentially a 150-mile drive from there, and you're on the border with Mexico. And Sonora has one of the largest automotive and auto sector clusters in all of Mexico. So we already know that Lucid has signed 2 contracts with, parts and component suppliers out of Hermosillo, Sonora, that'll be supplied to Arizona. And I believe Lucid really gives us the example of how the automotive sector is going to function in the future. It's not just one side. It's not all of it in one side, and it really hasn't been. But I think that continues to be the future. The USMCA and the rules of origin requirements, particularly in the automotive sector, really makes North America very competitive for manufacturing if you're intent on selling those products and commodities in North America. So we're very excited about that. And I'll wrap up by saying Arizona is ready for North American trade, the growth that's coming through USMCA. We have invested tremendously in our border infrastructure, that is our ports of entry, and the connectivity of those ports of entry to the federal highway system on both sides of the border. We've invested in partnership with our federal agencies, well over $800, almost $900 million in our border infrastructure, working on another $500 million more on the Arizona side. And Mexico has invested about $1.8 billion on the Highway 15 that connects Arizona all the way through to Mexico City, touching on 8 Mexican states. And as we'd like to remind people, people are looking at export opportunities, but there's also import opportunities. These roads flow 2 ways, so we need to be looking at opportunities in both directions.
Well, thank you so much, Luis. Gosh, this is like drinking water out of a fire hose. There's so much that Al and Mel brought. Already some unions and conglomerates being talked about here. So what I'd like to do now is go to what I'm going to call the open mic, or free-for-all, if you will. I've got 3 questions, and each panelist can answer any way they see fit. So I'm going to throw out the first question. First question is, NAFTA did not address digital trade because we didn't have the internet infrastructure. We didn't have Google, and we didn't have Outlook and the social media and so on and so forth. And Al, you and I know that when we went to Monterey Tech for their little internet session there. So how does each one of you see emphasis now in a particular chapter for e-commerce and e-trade and digital trade working under USMCA? So whoever wants to go, Melissa, you mentioned it, so why don't you go first, and then we'll have Al and Luis chime in.
Just a request for the
anybody who knows me will tell you that I'm a huge internet shopper. And so obviously I am very supportive of e-commerce, not just at the individual level, but for supporting supply chain activity. So, it can be a real time saver, and it can also be very important from the educational perspective. The limitation is the absence of universal penetration of internet service. A few years back, the Arizona District Export Council sponsored a session up on the Navajo Reservation because the thought was that, particularly for areas that are more geographically isolated, even within the state of Arizona, that could represent new opportunities for Native entrepreneurs. But we very quickly discovered that it's a great idea, but it's not universally available. So I think that if we're going to realize the maximum benefit from those provisions in all three countries, we need to continue to work on building out our internet infrastructure.
Luis,
Okay, I'll jump in. Yes, I agree with everything that Melissa said, and I'm sure I'm going to agree with what Luis is going to also impart. I guess let me talk about a little bit of my concerns about what we're discussing right now. We've always had a situation where enforcement, the laws are in place in all three countries, but the enforcement on the Mexican side is different than on the US and Canadian. And that's why I'm hoping that USMCA will start to hopefully bring it closer together. I think when you look at where the really epicenters are, it is California, Arizona, and of course, Mexico, and Texas in particular, excuse me. New Mexico wants to be a player. They are still trying to develop Santa Teresa, but they're really kind of an adjunct to El Paso, Juarez. And so it's really a Texas, Arizona, California play. And on the Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, and on down to Huila and Tamaulipas. And that's really border zone. Luis, if I remember correctly, didn't you represent the governor back a couple of 3-4 governors to the border governors conference on behalf of Arizona? So you know exactly what I'm talking about. So to cut it short, I really think that we've got, and Melissa, I agree with you. I'll do whatever it takes, whether I have to help convene it or not. We really need to pull all the players together because, especially with the change in administration that's imminent in Washington and what the Mexican administration has done to really kind of put, and I'm going to be really candid with this, a damper on investment coming into Mexico because we get a lot of those discussions. And so I very much would like to look at a Arizona focus because one of the reasons I said yes to being part of this panel of ours that Joe Guzman reached out to me is we haven't talked about the Native American communities as part of the small business and other activities. Because when you look at, and you know this, Luis, the Tohono O'odham is right on both sides of the border, Arizona and Chihuahua. So I think that's where the focus needs to be. That's why we started this working group, and I really look forward to working with you guys.
Luis?
Well, I totally agree with everything that Al just said, and there are several tribes on the Arizona border with Mexico. There's the Tohono O'odham, there's the Cocopa, there's the Quechan on the Mexican side. On the Sonora side is the Yaquis. So there is a tremendous opportunity there. And there's also tremendous need in the Native American community, where there needs to be greater economic development, job creation, and sustainable job creation for Native American communities that are not simply, and forgive me for generalizing, many of them have focused on the casino and the gambling community, but that has not spawned the idea of broader diversification, manufacturing, assembly, you name it, that can be happening on tribal land, and I think is a tremendous area of opportunity. I do want to make an additional comment based on what Mel was mentioning. I participated in a webinar with the Bajío region in Coahuila and Durango, Torreón and Gomez Palacio recently, and the question was, we're talking about these major opportunities. What about the really small companies, the 5-10 people companies? Within the era still, at least for the foreseeable future, with an era of COVID, where you can't just get on a plane and go meet your client and go selling. And that's why I said this is the opportunity to start business. It is social media. It is minor investments, relatively speaking, on getting a virtual presence for your company, for the products that you're selling. There are multiple platforms available, whether it's Etsy, whether it's Shopify, whether it's Facebook, and the small business packages have created. There's no need to wait for COVID, as you were indicating, Charles, to really leverage what USMCA has to offer. Yesterday, Federal Express announced a major investment in Mexico for fulfillment. They're making investments in central Mexico and the northern border, not only in the eastern parts of the border, but also here in Nogales, Sonora. I mean, they're investing, yesterday they announced like 25, 30 million, but combined it's probably $50, $60 million that Federal Express is investing. That's, they're already anticipating the growth and fulfillment of, less than truckload shipping. One package, two packages, a box. There are those opportunities that currently exist, and there are provisions to protect you that are part of the USMCA for those very small businesses. So it is, the mining conglomerates all the way down to, an artisan that wants to sell its products and ship them by FedEx to a destination in the US or Canada. There's tremendous opportunity all the way around.
Well, thank you, Luis. And I concur with all three of you in this area of digital trade. The next question is dealing with Chapter 25 and the encouragement of robust participation of small businesses. How do you see chambers of commerce, foundations, institutes, and universities coming together to create these centers, whether they're incubators or export assistance centers, to share best practices and market research, open to anybody?
Oh, I think, Al, you got to take that one.
Yeah. Thank you, Luis. I'll get you. Don't worry. Yeah. Let me speak to that directly, because what my concern is at this point is how do we make it really work on all three parts of our North American borders. And by the way, I included North America. I started, as you know, by bringing in the Panama Canal all the way to the North Pole.
Yep.
So that's number one. Number two, and it is really that all based on supply chain, transportation, et cetera. But looking at what we're looking at right now is that you've got a situation where it still is very uneven as to the supply chains, and for the little company or small company to get into the game. So the real entry points is a robust supply chain. But that then has the ability to share risk as well as investment and reaping whatever kind of profits and or entry into market. So that's a critical piece. Arizona still needs to get into that game and along, because you look at Texas, they're into it big time, and you look at San Diego, Southern California, because of the history with Tijuana and Maquiladora. I mean, so Arizona still, in my estimation, has a great opportunity to really move in to that process, but it's got to be driven by major companies and or medium-sized companies, the tier 1, tier 2 automotive sector in particular. You talked about that, Luis. So I think if we can really focus that, and I think of Arizona in specific, then we're going to be able to help these small businesses to include the Native Americans. Because when you start listening to discussions about USMCA, I never hear about Native Americans. But when you look at what the lower 48 has done, it is casinos. But look at the Athabascans up in the North Slope as a good example. They have major contracts with our federal government and the oil industry, because when I was with ARCO, as an example. And so it's all these pieces. And I think if anything, that I want to spend my time trying to rationalize the implementation of the USMCA.
I want to jump in there because what you just said, Al, is so key. One of the fundamental difficulties for small businesses of any stripe, but particularly for native small businesses, they don't have the resources to understand an agreement of this sort. As you mentioned at the beginning, Charles, we have 63 chapters. If you looked at that as a document, it stands well above my head.
Yeah.
Major corporations like Freeport, where I worked until recently, have a whole floor of lawyers.
Yeah.
And in addition, we have batteries of lawyers on standby through contracts to go through agreements like that word by word and spot the opportunities for us and be able to advise our management on how we need to position ourselves quickly in order to capitalize on these agreements. Small businesses have no resources with which to do those sorts of things. That's where I think that organizations like the chambers can play a really key role. The chambers already understand what the economic structures are in our state, and they already understand what the hurdles are for groups like the Native Americans. No one is better positioned than the chambers to be able to break that document down into the pieces necessary to be able to say to the Tnohoham, to the Navajo, to the Hopi, here's something that applies for your people. Here's what you should be working directly on with your economic development authorities and with other institutions like Northern Arizona University that has such great relationships with the tribes.
Let me just chime in on that one. That in my background, I represented the Crow tribe of Montana, a very natural resource rich, land rich tribe that's on the border with Canada. And the opportunities of an organization having a gigantic landmass and natural resources, whether it's water or oil or gas or titanium or coal, have not been properly put into, using Al's term, the supply chain at any level. So I think we need to explore that, particularly as I look at the map of Arizona and I see the large land masses of the Navajo and the Hopi. And Al, you sent John Little and I down there, the Tohono O'odham, to start there. And I've got to give Al credit. He wanted to start electronic commerce for Native Americans on the border. And we worked with, it was IBM and Joe. We worked with Carlos Slim after he bought CompUSA. And we had a very talented instructor in how to work computers, go down the Tohono O'odham. That's what, 10, 12 years ago, Al?
1998. That was a long time ago.
Okay, so we need to ramp that up again under this new agreement. So thank you all. I think this part, do we have any time left, Christian, on the open mic?
Please, let Louise get in this.
Louise wants to give a comment, and then I'd suggest we move on to a question or two from the audience.
Any closing comments from the panel?
No, I think I'd rather get
time to Louise.
Nah, let's get to the questions. Let's see
what I see. There's a lot of questions, so go ahead. Christian will take the questions, and she'll direct it either to a panelist or to the entire panel. Go ahead, Christian.
Thanks, Charles. I believe this will be open. After several decades, international trade agreements might be expected to have unintentional consequences arise. Does anyone worry about any specific unintentional consequence, and is there a process to amend on a set time frame?
I'll jump in. One of the ones that I always worry about, and Luis, you're specific, and the same with you, Melissa, in your present positions there at Arizona. The border is always leaped over with trade balances between major corporations or Texas or major centers. And so if there's any preoccupation that I have, how do we make sure that the border does not continue to be passed through? And that's, of course, exacerbated with the rail and the trucking in specific. And so that to me then could be a real inhibitor to small business. That's why I keep saying, get them into the supply chain. And that's where I would hope you guys, lady and gentlemen of Arizona, focus on that. That's why I like what Northern Arizona U is doing to try to bring in the tribes as well. But there's a bigger piece to this, and that is, how do you all connect up with major corporations in the automotive, in the aerospace, which are now really building out in Chihuahua City, as well as maquiladoras, and then leapfrog them into so that they're actually being part the cross-border trade with not being inhibited because there's a pass-through going at the border. So that's my concern.
Louis?
I totally agree with Al. That, when the original NAFTA was passed, that's one of the issues we brought up is, it's a great agreement, but you need to be able to enable the business to take place. That means goods and people crossing the border in a timely and effective, efficient, safe manner. Clearly, with the USMCA, we still have some of those challenges. We need more investment in our border infrastructure. We're also looking at, the inspection procedures, the number of staffing available to open up. You build the infrastructure, but you don't have enough personnel to open up the lanes. And, that ends up having an impact on the cost of doing business across the border. That happens on the U.S.-Mexico border as well as the U.S.-Canada border. So it's North America. It's a North American issue, not just a single country or one border issue. So we've, Al, and you're absolutely right. We have remained very focused on making those investments or fighting to get those investments prioritized. It continues to be a challenge because it's not a $5 or $10 million investment. It's each project is 100, 150, 200, $250 million a pop. So it's big money projects. They're binational in nature, and they take years from concept until they're completed. We have to find a way that if USMCA now moves at digital speed, we need to be able to move much faster in that infrastructure to get people and goods across the border. So Al, I'm absolutely in tune with you. There are other areas that some people have expressed concern, whether it's environmental and labor. And I think this agreement does, and it elevates the watchful eye over those issues. So it is incumbent upon us as well to hold those people accountable, hold business accountable, hold governments accountable, to making sure those provisions are not simply ignored for the almighty dollar. There is a balance that can be found, a very successful and sustainable balance. And we're doing it every day here on the border. We do cross the border on environmental issues all the time. We have the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality and its counterpart in Sonora created a binational environmental and ecological plan for the next 5 years. So that's one example. You can't just plan on your side of the border. It's got to be a holistic plan, which guides the efforts of both sides of the border. So I'm very proud of the work we have done here through the Office of the Governor, the Arizona-Mexico Commission, and this level of planning at a binational level. We haven't seen it done in other parts of the border.
I would just jump in here by saying that all trade agreements have unintended consequences because no one can predict over a period of even a year, much less 5 years or decades, which industries are going to thrive and which industries are not. And that carries with it, obviously, human costs. And I would say that particularly moving forward, there can be a grave unintended consequence of leaving behind even more people than are currently left behind in this country. Because to take the fullest advantage of the provisions of an agreement like this, as we were discussing earlier today, you need to be tech savvy, you need to have access to the internet, you need to be able to process good amounts of information quickly and succinctly, and those skills are unfortunately in decreasing supply, I would say. As to the question, is it reviewed? Yes, there's a provision in the USMCA that it be reviewed in 5 years.
Well, thank you, panelists. Kristen, how are we doing on time?
I would suggest that we conclude with some final remarks, Charles.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. listening to, and by the way, this was very entertaining for me. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that the audience and my fellow panelists did too. Number one, small business participation must be robust. And I see from hearing from Al and Melissa and Luis that we have organizations, whether they're foundations or chambers or institutes or universities, that can pull together and create some of these centers, accelerators, and incubators to share best practices and, more importantly, market research. And Al, getting down to the supply chain, and I'm really glad that you brought up supply chain as being a key link to participating more robust for small and medium-sized enterprises. I would just say that in one of my tours with federal government at the Department of Defense, I was in procurement, small business procurement, and they had a mentor-protege program that would hook up a large company with a small company and would provide 3-year financing to get that small company into a relationship with the large company. It's called the mentor-protege program. And I think we ought to look into that. Maybe the federal government can come up with a similar plan for USMCA. Number two, digital trade is here to stay. I think that we have consumer behavior that's been evolving over the course of time, and businesses large and small that adapt to the evolving digital trade will be those successful companies. And I would say, going back to small business, we can create these successful entrepreneurial hubs. I can envision it now after another conference or two. And thirdly, the investments. And Luis, thank you for enlightening all of us on the billions and millions of dollars that are going into investments already. And what I see with the Arizona Trade Corridor, we have the universities, right? We've got University of Arizona on the border. We've got Arizona State in the middle, and we've got Flagstaff. There's already a path, a corridor. And I see this becoming an opportunity to become a booming trade corridor with all the different components, whether the chambers, the universities, foundations like yours, Al, the Foundation for Sustainable North American Sustainable Development, coming together and making Arizona a bigger player with California and Texas. So if anybody else has a summary comment, please make it. You each got a second or two to make summary comments, and then we're going to put this in the can so that people can look at it and maybe get continuing education credits for listening to the four of us. Al, last word.
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to offer up the opportunity for not only the universities, but Melissa, Luis, because I am going to be reaching out to you. If I've already talked to Luis, but I'll reach out to you, Melissa. I really think there's a focus that can be done that is really that binational focus. And one of the things that I did, because I helped start the 12, 14 years ago, the Binational Sustainable Laboratory in New Mexico. And it unfortunately was going to become defunct and just go away. And so we took it over. It's now part of the US-Mexico Culture and Education Foundation as a separate foundation. Because we've got our Buen Vecino internship program, Charles. We have our environmental windows that we've had.
Right.
But I'd like to commit that to, and this is for you, Luis, and Melissa, and Charles, and Joe Guzman. Let's get that 501c3 Binational Sustainable Laboratory and try to see how we can do a mentor-protege by state, by sector, and by the type of small, medium-sized businesses. So I'm putting that on the table. I hadn't thought about it until I got on today.
Thank you, Al. It's a great idea.